First of all, the reason why we decided to do this, we have four persons that we didn't actually know, but in our circle of family and friends who committed suicide over the past year. And at the same time, I was reading the Memoirs of a Suicide, which is an amazing book. And then also, at the same time, we got an email from the Suicide Prevention Seminar, which actually occurred December 6th. And what we wanted to do, and we emailed them, was we wanted to be part of that, because we thought, you know, not only is it just the mental health side, but there's also a spiritual side. So we tried to talk to them about bringing in Addison Cornwell to do a lecture about the spiritual aspects of suicide. But unfortunately, they're not ready for that. So, but we decided, you know what, we're going to do our own. And we had a seminar on Long Island on the 8th talking about the spiritual aspects of suicide, and Addison came out. So she did half, I did half. And so this is my part of the lecture. So if we go over the numbers, if we do the numbers on suicide, the number of deaths annually, 38,364. This is the last from the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention. This is their last, I think it was 2012. Cause of death rank, number 8 in the world. Number of emergency department visits for self-inflicted injury, 713,000. So in America, someone attempts suicide once every minute, and someone completes a suicide once every 17 minutes. And then if you look at it, the big picture throughout the world, 2,000 people kill themselves every day, which is, you know, it's kind of, you don't really think about it until you look at the numbers. So about 2/3 of the people who complete suicide are depressed at the time of their deaths. And depression that is untreated or undiagnosed is the #1 case of suicide. And obviously, depression, there's all different causes. It's not just a chemical imbalance. As we know from the Spiritist view, is that it also can be spiritual. So we're going to delve into the causes of suicide. There are so many different causes of people deciding to take their lives. And the first, it's an act of escape for some people. They figure that, you know, whether it's the death of a loved one, financial disaster, they lose their money, a long drawn-out illness. You know, a lot of people take their lives because they feel that they don't want to suffer due to an illness, a crippling mental illness, or a disappointment in love. So there's a lot of different reasons why someone might end their life, but basically the main cause is that it's pride and selfishness. And then again, when you have, you know, traditional religions, a lot of times it's a superficial belief. So they may go to church, but they don't have the deeper understanding of what the spiritual life is all about. And therefore, it doesn't console them enough where they feel they have the strength to continue. Or that the punishment for killing themselves is not enough to deter them from actually taking their lives. This is a quote from Gandhi: "If patience is worth anything, it must endure to the end of time, and a living faith will last in the midst of the blackest storm." And what we know from Spiritism is that a lot of times help was always on the way. When you find out people have killed themselves, if you look at the spiritual picture afterwards, you realize that if they had just held on a little longer, help was on its way. And Romeo and Juliet is a good example of committing suicide. Of course, Shakespeare wanted to make a tragedy, but it's based on probably on real life, is that a lot of times when people lose their love, they fear they can't continue to live without it. And it is a cause of suicide. You know, certainly we see today how many examples you see in the newspapers or on TV of you know, if you watch like these programs of like on like the History Channel or whatever of like love gone wrong, all those, there's so many of them nowadays, but you see how love can be twisted into a cause for death, either murder, suicides, or you can hear about it all the time. Many times love or the lack of becomes the cause of suicide. By transforming another into your sole reason to exist, we lose ourselves and the focus of our purpose here. Because a lot of times we put everything into one person rather than looking to ourselves for the answers or the strength to continue. We make them our sole reason to exist, is this love for this one person. We can't take ownership of another person. We are responsible for ourselves. And possessive love is contrary to true love, which nurtures devotion and gives of itself freely. And this is right from Shakespeare. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. Because love is a very powerful emotion, and certainly, you know, it can take a wrong turn and can cause so much passion that eventually it explodes. Obsession is another cause of suicide, and obsessing spirits oftentimes will infiltrate the thoughts of others, or the obsessed, and insist on the idea of suicide. So somebody who's already on the brink, who's going through a very difficult time, if they're not spiritually aware, they can be overtaken by spirits who are kind of suggesting the idea of suicide. So if a person is becoming obsessed by a spirit, oftentimes they'll tell them, you must kill yourself, you can't continue to live. Whereas if they were spiritually balanced, they would be able to not listen to those voices, to get spiritual help, certainly through prayer or just looking into themselves for the strength. Now, if a person commits suicide because the spirits are obsessing them and pushing them to kill themselves, that's not an excuse for actually killing themselves, because it is their act. You know, even though it might have been suggested by a spirit, it's still their action, and they have control over that, because we are always masters of our own actions, and all of our thoughts belong to us, not to the spirits. So we have to differentiate between what is ours.
I have just a question.
Mm-hmm.
Before, just as before you said, it's like that majority of the cases are pride and selfish. Then we as Spiritists, we know that. But what about these organizations that are doing research about suicide? Do they have this idea also?
No.
They don't have?
No, because they're not looking, they're looking at the mental health aspect. And certainly you have to, that's part of suicide. You have to explore all the different.
They don't see the source,
if they don't look at the spiritual aspect of it, they're missing a whole part that they don't understand. They don't understand the idea of pride and selfishness being, part of it. So, and a lot of times these obsessor spirits, and it's right in the book here, Memoirs of a Suicide, a lot of these spirits are formerly committed suicide in past lives, and now they come back as ignorant, not necessarily evil, but very ignorant, and they get enjoyment out of suggesting suicide to those who are weak, because it makes them feel like a sense of excitement to push human beings, because they have no care for life or death to them. They're spirits. They love to pull those down into their blackness. So, as for the obsessor spirits, it is quite common that the tortured father who cares for a son with serious mental and physical dysfunctions was the obsessor who in the past hastened him to the abyss of suicide. So we're always also, we come back into the life with the people that we've come in contact with before, and oftentimes we choose to take on difficult cases as a way of making reparations for our past. Self-punishment is something that's a cultural thing, and you see it with the Harry Carey, the committing of suicide in the Japanese culture is a good example. People who punish themselves for a crime by committing suicide does not mitigate the circumstances. It instead only worsens the sufferings of a guilty conscience. No one is exempt for the rigors of earthly justice. And there are always those who believe that they must wash their honor in blood. This is part of a culture of revenge or retaliations. In the Japanese culture, they felt that any kind of humiliations that were suffered by them or their family, they could simply wash away by taking their lives. Obviously, knowing from the spiritual perspective, once they cross over, the amount of confusion that must cause that spirit to know that it's, you know, doesn't even know where they are, basically. But this is also something that, as you know, as we as a race of human spirits, we are slowly starting to get away from things like this. This is more of ancient traditions which no longer have any meaning in today's societies. It's slowly starting to change as we become more spiritually knowledgeable. And then there's unconscious suicide. So if you know from the book Na Solar, Andre Louise ends up in the lower regions basically as a suicide, but a suicide of unconscious actions. And you know, that could be cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, eating disorders. Those are all, you know, some of the more common ways that people subconsciously kill themselves, because you know that smoking cigarettes is going to kill you, and yet you still do it. So therefore, it is a form of suicide. And it occurs when we mistreat our bodies, because we end up being expelled from it like a house that collapses because the occupant neglects its maintenance. So we're given these bodies from God. It's a gift, and therefore when we don't take care of it, when we intentionally destroy it, it's considered suicide from the spiritual perspective. So atheism is also a big part of a cause of suicide, because if you have no conception of God, or if you choose to believe that God does not exist, then that kind of world is one where hastening it to the end would make sense, because if you're here for one lifetime and you're having a terrible life, why not just kill yourself and end it? So it's when if you don't have a belief in afterlife, or if you don't believe that you are an immortal spirit, or that God does not exist, then for a lot of atheists, suicide becomes a very good option. And there's a good example in the book Heaven and Hell of a spirit, you know, because in Heaven and Hell there's numerous communications, some of them with spirits who committed suicide, and one of the communications is about one who was an atheist. And Allan Kardec reports on an atheist who killed himself because of a weariness of life without hope. Then later in the spirit world, becoming aware that nothing does not exist, he felt horribly tormented, as if his soul had been placed in a furnace. One's consciousness of God is a characteristic of an evolved spirit. We must therefore ask how there can be materialists when they have passed through the material world. Shouldn't they have an intuition of him? And for he who believes, no proof is necessary. For he who does not believe, there is never enough proof. So it's true that if you ever have an argument with somebody who is an atheist, no matter what kind of proof, you could bring God down and put it right in front of the person. They would just not agree that God exists for them, because this is what they believe in there. So atheism is a big problem in society today, and certainly it's a major cause of suicide. And another cause is genetics. American researchers have established a direct relationship between low levels of serotonin in the brain, the feeling of well-being, and the tendency towards suicide. Now, from what we know of in Spiritism, is the paraspirit right? The paraspirit is the link between the soul and the physical body. And a lot of times what happens is this paraspirit carries with it from its past existences a tendency to be, if it was in its former life, let's say a suicide who comes back, it will carry with it the deep ramifications and damages of the suicide in its paraspirit. So, of course, it's going to have low levels of serotonin in the brain because it's suffering from the depression from its previous existence. And so you can explain these genetic causes as being also spiritual, because the paraspirit is really what makes the physical body. You know, a lot of the ingredients that go into us are because we have damaged our paraspirit from previous existences.
And excuse me, do you think that someone that carries the genetic lack of these symptoms while they live on Earth, do you think they can, if they start feeling that kind of thing, I want to die, is this something that it can be done to protect them, or once they just go by the feeling and they, you know, how the spiritual world, is this some protection for the spirit that keeping care there along with them?
Yeah, a person who comes back, a suicide, generally reincarnates fairly quickly and is usually extremely damaged, depressed. A lot of mental illnesses are caused by previous suicide. So what happens is there's always help, and you have to also remember that you have to explore the mental health side of it too, because there are, medications really do help mitigate some of the circumstances of being extremely unbalanced, but also it needs spiritual treatment. You have to explore every option available. You know, it's difficult when it's children who are unbalanced because they don't understand spirituality so much. But as they grow, you want to make sure that, they're learning.
Because my question is that, when does it stop? If the spirit cares that on their genetic level, if they keep it coming back with that on his genetic level, would it be interesting to one point if he don't kill himself anymore, then he just get rid of that in his body, would it be interesting to know how he...
It takes several lifetimes. Usually, yeah, depending on how hard they're willing to work, because it's all about the individual. There's all different cases. There are those who kill themselves and quickly repair themselves in the spiritual world. They still have to reincarnate, but everyone's on a different level. So there are extreme cases where they continue to just kill themselves over and over. And eventually they end up, hundreds of years in the spiritual world, still bleeding from there, because it's in the book, still bleeding from those same wounds that they suffered, hundreds of years before. Certainly being young is a cause of suicide, because we are so unstable in our teenage years. We've all been teenagers, so we all know how crazy the world seems in that time period, and it just flies around you. And it's, insecurity, a lot of disturbing relationships, anxiety over school, bullying is a big problem today. That's questions of sexuality, the difficulty in defining a career path for some people, who have parents who are really pressuring them. That's something that causes them to such anxiety. And then just living in this crazy world, because kids are exposed to so much information all the time. Whereas, when I was younger, we didn't have the internet or all these TV channels. You basically didn't know what was going on in the world. Now they're exposed to it all the time, 24/7. And that makes them feel uneasy. At home with our children, we always try to limit their amount of time on the computer, and it's very difficult, but you try to limit it because it's too much information. It's like sensory overload for them. And when we look at children, we see them as being these innocent, dependent, they always needing care from us, and But we don't really look at them as what they really are, which is a spirit. And a lot of times they carry with them these addictions from former lives, mental illnesses that are carried through. So we don't always know who they were in their last lifetimes. And so we look at them as our, like, we almost take ownership of them. But as they hit the teenage years and they start to show who they really are is when we have problems.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a good example. And I think everybody knows about the bullying case, the Rutgers student who jumped off the George Washington Bridge because he was, being bullied by his roommates. And it's a sad story because when we look deeper into it, so when Tyler Clementi told his parents he was gay, 2 days before he left for Rutgers University in the fall of 2010, he said he had known since middle school. And Tyler told a friend that the conversation had gone well and that his father was very accepting. He wrote in a text message, "Mom has basically completely rejected me." 3 weeks later, he jumps off the George Washington Bridge after discovering that his roommate had used a webcam to spy on him having sex and had sent it out to Twitter, messages encouraging others to watch. So, what we don't know is what happened afterwards. Obviously, if you lose a child to suicide, it's got to be the most difficult thing ever. I mean, I can't even imagine that. I have 5 kids altogether, and I've managed to get 2 of them through the tough years. But I can't imagine losing my child to suicide. So what it did was it really changed, and you have a choice, I guess. You only have 2 choices. You either go down or you go up. And for these parents, I guess they decided we're not gonna let this destroy us. We're gonna turn it into something positive. So after their son's suicide, it forced the parents to make changes and be honest with themselves. They left the church that made Mrs. Clementi so resistant to her son's declaration, because really it was the mother that basically, and because of what she was taught in her church, that being gay is sinful. And it made him unable to understand what he was supposed to do in life. So their middle son, James, acknowledged that the family had long suspected and said that he too was gay. And the family is devoting itself to a foundation promoting acceptance with the hope of preventing the suicides of gay teenagers. So as you see, in this particular case, after such a tragedy, they did something good with it. And she could have felt so guilty that it just destroyed her. Instead, she decided to do something positive and in turn make his death worth something rather than, add to it. Because that's what would have happened if she had gone down. Plus, seeing that their middle son also felt comfortable enough to come out and tell them that he too was gay. So, I mean, you can see how you can turn something that's so dark into something that has some light. All right, so euthanasia, that's another cause of death, is suicide, and it's considered suicide. A lot of people, right now there's debate here in the United States and I guess across the world of whether euthanasia actually is suicide or not. People feel that they have the right to end their own lives because they believe it belongs to them. There are many today who consider euthanasia as an act of mercy and the right of the dying person to end their life. But life is the divine gift. It is not ours to alter or destroy. The Lord directed us into the physical experience. It therefore falls to Him to define when we should leave. And this is important because if you don't know, you may be meant to suffer. And it may seem unfair to those who don't know your backstory line, your previous existences. But if you're suffering, there's a reason for it, because nothing happens without God's will. And if you suffer, there's got to be a benefit to it. So if people who are dying of cancer or whatever it is, if they're suffering, there is a purpose for it. And it's not our lives to take. So whatever time you have left, you have to live it. Human legislation needs to mirror that of the divine legislation, which is consolidated in the lesson of Jesus, which emphasizes a respect always towards life. All right, so now we're going to go into the consequences of suicide. So, we're talking about the causes of what makes somebody commit suicide. Now we're going to look at the other side of what happens after. So first of all, once a person commits suicide, they realize that nothingness does not exist, that they did not achieve their goal, and that they did not die, and that they still exist. They still suffer, and they feel the pain, and it is a traumatic and terrifying situation, which is really well described in the Memoirs of a Suicide. By damaging their physical body, that is like in the case of a gunshot wound, this in turn damages their spiritual body. And if you've ever heard of the Dr. Ian Stevenson, who did he was from the University of Virginia, I believe.
Virginia.
Yeah, and when he went to India and was examining cases of reincarnation, he saw that a lot of these children that were born and found the previous existence was a violent death or a suicide. A lot of times they came back with the same like birthmark patterns of the suicide, like if they had shot themselves. So it leaves a physical imprint on the spiritual body, which later on transforms into the next life. So we damage ourselves so badly by committing suicide, and oftentimes it takes the spirits of suicides many lifetimes to overcome it. And the spirits also of suicides relive over and over the moments of their demise. They're like constantly in like a circle of feeling the suicide, of experiencing it over and over. It's horrible. And sad. And this is right from that book. It's a good example. This is when he first realizes that he still exists. He was the author, the spiritual author of the book was a Portuguese writer who went blind and became like penniless, and he decided to just end his life. He didn't have much spirituality. So this is what he tells his, through mediumship, how he felt. He says, "But how? It could not be. I had not died. Did I not feel alive right now? So why was I alone, immersed in the gloomy loneliness of the place of the dead? Inarguable facts, however, impose themselves on humans and on spirits with majestic naturalness. I had not yet concluded my naive, desperate questions when I suddenly saw myself, and as if in front of a mirror I saw myself dead, lying in a coffin in a clear state of decomposition in the depths of a grave, the exact one I had just stumbled over." So you can imagine that, and that's really descriptive because he was a writer. He was able to describe perfectly that moment when he realizes the terrifying conclusion of his suicide, where he is now. That's awful. It's a dark and gloomy idea, but we have to understand that that is where we end up when we kill ourselves. So yes, there's this painful separation of the spirit from the material body because the act of suicide is such a selfish act. There's a connection that we all have to our material bodies, and because it's selfish and materialistic to commit suicide, the spirit remains connected to that dead physical body longer than it would be if you were, a more balanced spiritual being. The fluidic connection, or they call the silver cord, still remains attached to the corpse. Normally, the spirit disconnects with the decomposition of the body, which is usually several days, but it may linger in a cemetery as if still drawn to the corpse. So there's the confusion of where it is. So they say also that those who have nightmares of being buried alive probably had an experience of this nature in previous lives. All right, so all suicides tend to form groups in the lower zone. They're basically shuttled to these really dark, it's called the Valley of the Suicides. It's where they all end up being. And they continue to torment themselves. And like I said before, they're still bleeding from their wounds. Whatever they did, however they decide to kill themselves is still all around them. They're imagining it, they're reliving it. The spiritual author finds himself in this valley of the suicides, and they're all confined to these dark, numbered caves in the side of the mountain. That's where they stay, until at such point when they begin to realize what, they have a spiritual understanding of what's happening to them, and they ask for God's forgiveness. But until they do, they are pretty much kept here. And it's done so well in the movie Na Solar. They show that. I mean, that's such a great description of how it is there. And there are these caravans of good spirits that do come and take them when they're ready. And all these illustrations are from Dante's, right from the Dante's version of hell. And it really does. He probably spiritually was a squirt, because they're like, it's a perfect. Yeah.
It's interesting that he was very good at describing hell, but not very well in heaven.
Yeah, yeah, you don't get any descriptions of that. Yeah, exactly.
Had more experience down there.
Yeah, a lot of people. We've all spent our time there too,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
so, you know, not to be judgmental, because we've all been there at some point. This idea of this confinement in the purgatory regions of the spirit world, they do not establish themselves like earthly prisons, because we must fulfill a determined sentence. And like I said before, the suicide remains there for the time necessary until he overcomes the greater of his disorders, this being the consequence of the violence he practices against himself. Another good movie which kind of describes the suicide is the one with Robin. What is it called? Dreams May Come, with Robin Williams. Yeah, that's a great movie too, to describe what it's like to be. I mean, she's in that house that used to be hers, and it's falling apart, and it's dark, and it's like, that's pretty much what it must be like. So if the suicide is dominated by despair, revolt, and guided by pride, this will tend to prolong their confinement in the lower zones. There are always spiritual benefactors, though, who do observe them like doctors and care for them like patients in an asylum. And in the book, Memoirs of a Suicide, it's described perfectly how the mother of Jesus, Mary of Nazareth, has a whole community of spiritual workers that focus mainly on suicides. And they actually have to send like armed guards down, caravans, into these lower regions to take the patients out. And they're basically, that's what they are, patients at that point when they come to get them. But they actually have to be armed with lances to even go down into those really dark regions. And then they bring them back and put them in the hospital, very much like in Na Solar it's shown. So the treatment in the spiritual world, like we were saying, is that there are some who receive hospitalization, and that takes a certain amount of time as they have to rebalance themselves somewhat, and it takes a lot of work from the workers in the spiritual realm to get them to a point where they can understand kind of what happened to them, and then the remorse and guilt that they feel, especially after those that they've left behind. There are some that are so like not able to accept what they have done, their actions, that they are forced to be reincarnated right away, because being in the spiritual world will serve no purpose for them. So they're basically put right back into the next available body to redo the earth. Like it's like a cleansing for them. Hopefully they will be able to do a better job, but they're not given any kind of counsel or anything because they're not capable of understanding. And then there are some that work as trainees and receive education in the spirit world. They're all at some point have to reincarnate into the physical body, but in a lot of cases, some of them stay around to actually help in the spiritual centers as they learn what their responsibilities are. And some remain imprisoned. They actually have it's very much like a prison but it's a prison of their own making. They're just so dark and evil spirits and so ignorant to the light of God that they remain there in these prison towers until they can get to the point, and it takes hundreds of years. But again, all must return to the flesh to expiate their past crimes against the law of nature. And it really is. The suicide is a crime against the laws of nature. So Shiko Xavier says that the suicide will take 200 years to recuperate with the need for 1 or 2 incarnations in the physical body. And that's just to cleanse itself of what it's done.
And what happens with many suicides that they have a tendency to commit again suicide in the next life. So they start to build this karma more and more.
Right. That's like a doubling up of that's already its karma. Because we all have knowledge of when we go to sleep, we're in the spirit world. So we have knowledge of what we've done in the past. It's you have to be able to be spiritually balanced enough to bring it into your material world and make it part of your learning process. Future consequences. So the cleansing of the spiritual body followed by the reconfiguration of the immortal spirit itself through trials and tribulations. Oftentimes, in the spirit world, and it's explained here in this book and also Nasalar, you get to model your next body. You get to choose the level of difficulty that you're going to have in your next incarnation. So a lot of times, if you want to hasten your progress, you'll want to take a body that has various mental illnesses associated, physical impairments, because it makes life maybe more of a struggle. But if you get through it, it's going to hasten your spiritual, your spirituality. If the cause of death were drowning, the new body will have problems with breathing, such as asthma, bronchitis, etc. Now, if you have a problem with that, don't think that you commit suicide. But yeah, we damage our spiritual bodies to the point where, when you come back, it's a lot of times you have problems in those areas. So, although we should avoid generalization, children who suffer from physical or mental problems are those who have debts from the past to expiate. And that makes sense, because nobody suffers. And when you see a child who's suffering and you say, how can that be fair? You don't know what that child was in the former life. You don't know the crimes he committed. So when you look at a child who has short stays on the earth, on the planet, the death of a child who's sick, a lot of times it's a cleansing experience. Or a lot of times it could be that the parents, it's beneficial for the parents to lose a child because of their past. So you never really know. We're not, these are generalizations, but there's always a meaning to everything that happens. And it's not really for us to know, but it's for us to experience and live through and suffer through. So there are deep consequences in the family when someone takes their life. It affects so many people. But it's always a choice, because no one is destined to deal with the suicide of a loved one, nor is anyone programmed to destroy their physical bodies. Living with those who suffer is, however, a trial for families. The suicide will be responsible for all the pain that he creates in those left behind. And, you know, oftentimes when the spirit in the spirit world who has committed suicide gets to a certain point where it starts to feel remorse, they will allow the spirit to return to his family or her family to see what's happened to his loved ones. And that is a great source of pain for the spirit, because he sees what damage he did to those that loved him and that he left behind.
Yeah, this point is very important, because usually the suicide only thinks about him. Oh, I have a problem I can't face, I can't live with that.
Right.
It's better I disappear, will be better for my family. I am the problem. And when they come back and they see many times bad consequences to their family,
right,
they feel the pain in a much, much higher level. And then they really repent.
Right.
Because then, oh my God, I did this to me, but the consequences to my kids,
right,
my wife, my husband.
Yeah, they suffer all that pain that is just, it's like tripled on them, the amount of pain they feel for what they're responsible for. Because it does cut into people's lives, suicide.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is this a turning point for the person to get rid of the suicide path? When they go back and they see what they've done to their families, do you think that this is the turning point when they see it in their heart? So now they start just accepting more what happened, and then that way they're able to just elevate themselves to a better path?
Well, for a lot of them, it's definitely, depending on their level of elevation as a spirit, their selfishness, it causes so much pain for them that the problem is that when they go back into the earthly life again, they forget all this. So it's up to them. If they're not like spiritually connected to anything, they'll fall into the same old patterns, the same addictions, the same things they did in their former lives. They'll repeat if they don't have that sense of God, that connection to a higher source that sustains you in those darker moments. So it all depends on the individual. So they may feel all the pain in the spirit world for what they did. They may choose another life to go back in the similar circumstances and make the same mistakes again, because they're just not at that level yet. So it all depends on, every case is different. There are those that turn around completely in that moment. I know he does in this book from his experiences. Okay, so preventative measures. There's a lot of different ways to prevent people from committing suicide, and the number one thing is education. There's always, before, if you know somebody who's, said something about committing suicide, or, a lot of cases it's somebody who knows somebody who's, who's in a dark place. It's education, I know that for me reading this book, it totally added to my idea of Spiritism. It gave me a deeper understanding, and it's so descriptive in what happens to a suicide. I can't imagine anybody even taking a chance after reading that book of killing themselves. Even if they didn't believe it, they would say, it's not worth it. No matter how bad life is, you got to struggle through it. So education is the key. And certainly practicing or acquiring good habits is another way. I mean, a lot of times, if you're really feeling down, I've never been to the point of feeling suicidal, but I've been down like everybody else and depressed. You do something that makes you feel good. And whether it's reading a good book, in this case, something that's like spiritually uplifting, seeing a good movie, painting, poetry, whatever it is, even if it's sports, something that's positive that makes you feel better about yourself is often all you need is one little stepping point to make yourself better You know, because it's like once you start doing something good, the good spirits always are there with you to help you, you know, rise up. Mental health treatment is so important also. We can't just focus on the spiritual side. There are also a lot of good social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists that can really help you through doing, you know, some heavy psychotherapy, some, you know, I mean, that's something that has to be considered always when you're in a deep depression and close to being suicidal. Is definitely, you can be helped. Fraternal counseling is something that, you know, obviously if you have access to it, and physical health, keeping up your physical health, because a lot of times, you know, when you're depressed and your serotonin levels are low, a lot of times you can stimulate yourself by being physically active. And afterwards, after it's already happened, after the damage of the suicide, you know, for the people who are left behind, you have to pray for them, and you have to trust that God is going to be fair and righteous. And again, education's a part of it too, understanding it. A spirit center is a great place to go, you know, I mean, you don't want to bombard a person who comes in with a loved one who's committed suicide and tell them they're, you know, they're in hell right now, and, you know, tell them all the dark side of it. But as they start to understand how the spiritual world works, and certainly Spiritism is the best way to understand the spiritual world. And of course, mediumistic meetings, if it's meant to be conveyed some sort of way to communicate. So I have my own personal experience with suicide because my mother committed suicide in 2003. And she suffered from MS for many years. She was diagnosed in 1986 with having MS. And as you know, that's not a treatable disease. So she went a long time carrying this disease around and struggling because she lived alone and she refused any kind of help. She was very stubborn about it. She would never get any help. She would never take like a live-in nurse or anything. And she lived here in Manhattan, and she was very strong-willed. But she decided, you know, that she did not want to live any longer. And so she decided that she was going to commit suicide. And she was very open about it, and she discussed it. And this is before I knew anything about Spiritism, but I used to tell her that, you know, we used to have like moral debates about it, because I told her that I didn't want to be part of it. I didn't want to help her because she wanted me to help her commit suicide. And I said I refused to, you know. I refused because I think it's wrong to do it. But it was her choice. And it took her 3 tries to do it. First 2 with pills, and finally with a razor, because she was so set on dying that, and she was miserable and depressed, and her life was just, had no meaning left in it anymore. And so when she you know, when someone commits suicide, obviously it's painful, and it left a hole in my life, which thank God I was able, you know, because it was around the time that I met my wife, so I was able to fill that with spirituality, and that really helped me through it, because at the time it was very confusing. When I did this presentation, I wanted to add my own personal experience into it. And so I was going through my mother's notes and stuff to me, because she wrote me a lot of notes. I mean, I had like a whole folder full of notes, mostly about how to care for her cat. You know, that was her I had like a little letter to me. She had like a folder on how to care for her cat. But anyway, she left me a note, and I started rereading it as I was doing this presentation, and I was shocked to find something that I never realized before about her, because I always thought of her as not being spiritual at all. But she left me a note, which I'm going to read to you now. And it's so odd that she chose this. All right. So what she said was, she says, this note here is a little sticky note to me. It says, "I don't really believe in any faith religion, but this should serve up as an expression of what I believe. love bomb. So, and she wrote, then death, so called, is but old matter dressed in some new figure and varied vest. Thus all things are but altered, nothing dies. And here and there the unbodied spirit flies, by time or force or sickness disposed, and lodges where it lights in man or beast, or hunts without till ready limbs it finds, and actuates those according to their kind. From tenement to tenement it's tossed. The soul is still the same, the figure only lost. And as the softened wax new seals receives, this face assumes and that impression leaves. Now called by one, now by another name, the form is only changed, the wax is still the same. So death, so called, can but the form deface. The immortal soul flies out in empty space to seek her fortune in some other place. So, I mean, just to end it on that note, even though she was not a spiritual person, she did have a deeper understanding, and she left me that little gem, which I guess when I read it at the time, I didn't really take away the meaning or understand it until now. But she did understand, basically, a little bit about spirituality, and she did believe that she was going to exist afterwards. So for me, that was like, you know, and in doing this presentation, it allowed me to find that again, you know, because I had to look for this folder in my house. It was not easy to find. So it was like, for me, it was like a little gift, you know, to say, you know, I do understand. And that's it. Oh, and these are the sources I used, by the way. I got a lot of information from Richard Simonetti's book on suicide. Of course, Memoirs of a Suicide, and Jasara's book, Those Left Behind, and of course the Allan Kardec books.